Okay. Nice to be back. Thanks everybody for coming out and everybody watching online. Welcome to FSX Expo 2021, and thanks to Callum and all the previous speakers and all the exhibitors here. It's been, a smaller show than we're used to, but I think overall great. Like the guys were saying yesterday, it's great to be back. And for me, it's also nice to be back on stage and talk to you guys about online flight simulation. Quick show of hands. Who here has not flown online before? Okay, so roughly about half. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is taking what you're probably already doing, taking your flight simulator, be that X-Plane or Prepared or Microsoft Flight Simulator, and adding some more complexity and realism to it, right? Because a lot of these systems have built-in functionality for air traffic control, but what we're going to do is we're going to take that online to the next level and have you talk and learn to talk to some real airline traffic controllers, or simulated anyways, right? So what we're going to do is talk about is why should you fly online, what the different networks are that are available and how they're different, kind of highlight the key differences as far as staffing, cost, and whatnot, and then how to get started. We'll do a quick walkthrough on what some of the radio communication looks like when you get online. And then if we have time, we'll talk about the ATOP program really quickly, which is something that I've gone through that I highly recommend if you are into, if you want to fly a big simulator at American Airlines or at JetBlue, one of their big A320 or 737 full motion simulators. A little bit about myself. I gave up a lucrative IT career to become an actor recently, and that's probably why you recognize my face. You're like, hey, he's that guy from the background there, the blurry guy. Or that guy walking in the door, or kind of there. Or maybe he's that cop. Look at that guy. But my biggest role so far, dead guy laying on the ground. Needless to say, no, I did not give up my IT career. Actually, I work for a company called Barry Aviation. We're a Part 135 airline. We're based in San Marcos, Texas. This is when I first got started flying, for real. I'm available, Twitter, Instagram, all the usual. My handle is German Aviator because I'm from Germany originally. I've done a lot of armchair flying. Microsoft Flight Simulator 3.0 is as far back as I can remember. Probably before that, but that's the first one I do recall. I switched to Prepared about 7 years ago because FSX, was being not, continued well. And then last year I switched to Microsoft Flight Simulator. But again, this is pretty agnostic about, you can fly online with any of your simulators that you have. I fly the fly-by-wire A320. It's a cool, almost study-level aircraft based on volunteers that have come together and made the A320 that comes with Microsoft Flight Simulator better. I'm also a VATSIM controller on the Houston ARTCC. What that means, VATSIM is one of the networks, and I don't only fly on that network, I also sit behind the radar screen as a volunteer, and I help provide services to you guys out there who want to go fly. And the ARTCC is an air route traffic control center. It's one of the pieces that makes up the online flying network, just like in the real world. Essentially, a lot of these networks take what air traffic control is like in the real world and copy that into an online version. As far as real world flying, I got my private pilot license back in 2014, instrument rating 2016, which I can highly recommend. If you're flying, get your instrumented rating, it's really cool. I'm working on my commercial license just for fun right now because it's just something I'm really into. And FAA Part 107, who can tell me what fancy certification that is? Drone pilot, yes, exactly. Very proud of that. Anyways, so let's talk about why should you fly online, right? And here is, the jokes don't get better, folks. Without pilots, the controllers would be really bored. We would have absolutely nothing to do without you guys. So please connect. Like I said, it doesn't get better. Okay, so I was showing this presentation to my wife last night, and she said, you can actually save a lot of money doing this, right? So for example, if you want to fly for real, you can get online and practice on the network without spending hundreds, thousands of dollars taking flying lessons. So that was a great one. There's a large online community of people out there already. There's literally probably hundreds of thousands of people doing this, right? So you would be joining a big community out there that's already out there. It adds a big degree of realism to your simulator because you're learning to fly your airplane, but it's sort of in a sandbox environment, right? And yes, Microsoft Flight Simulator, X-Plane, they all have some rudimentary ATC systems built in, but they're nothing equivalent to the real world, right? So that's where we're adding more realism to your flying. One of the big things when I first started, your fear of talking on the radio, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, because I was really scared hitting that push to talk button the first time, right? Because I didn't know what to say. My instructor just kind of threw me into the deep end and said, yeah, okay, let's go, let's fly. And I didn't know the terminology, and I didn't know what to say to air traffic control. But flying online, you can learn these things. Prompt efficient communication, you want to talk about on the radio, you want to say who you are, where you are, what your intentions are. You don't want to read a novel on while you're talking on frequency because you're taking up valuable space and time on the frequency that you're competing with other pilots for. So you want to learn to be prompt and efficient, say what you need to say, not less, not more. And then one of the things I think that's really important is, let's say you're flying at an uncontrolled airport where there's no air traffic control, but there's other people flying around the airport. You can use the frequency, you can listen in to what other people are saying. So if they're doing it correctly, you'll hear that, for example, there's people flying in the traffic pattern, right? They'll announce where they are in the traffic pattern, they're say they're landing, they're taking off. So you listen in, you can kind of build sort of that mental image of what's happening around the airport. And there's lots of fun group events. And by the way, if you guys have any questions, please, let's make this interactive, ask away. I'll try to answer it during the presentation, and if not, I'll be available after the presentation for any follow-up questions. So VATSIM, for example, there's lots of events that we have that are going on for making sure that things are staffed, right? So we have these crossfires, let's say between Houston and Denver. So we make sure that when this event is going on, we have staffing at all these facilities that provide the service between, on that route, which is not always a given with VATSIM, for example. All right, just really quick, on the other side, what that looks like is this. So when I sit behind my radar screen at home, this is what I see. So I see a bunch of little dots, aircraft symbols. I see, for example, there's an airplane over here. I see what flight level they're at. I see what speed they're at. And then I can give instructions based on that. Okay, so we get to a little bit of the heart of the matter. There's lots of different networks where you can fly online. And I've taken some of the big ones here. And again, there's more than what's on this list, but these are the major ones that you'll find out there. PilotEdge is a paid service, and the founder of PilotEdge used to actually be a VATSIM controller. So he kind of took what he learned over there and he made it into a service for folks, right? So that it's more of a guarantee that you get service because you pay money for it. And then there's VATSIM, which is what I control on. It's a free network. The coverage is global, as is IVAO and Eastern Hops. So these are all different sort of, you got to kind of pick and choose what you want to get out of it. PilotEdge, they'll charge you $20 a month or $35 a month, depending on what kind of coverage level you want to get. And I'll show a slide here. The next slide talks about what that looks like. They're staffed between 8 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you're on East Coast, it doesn't start till 11 a.m. But PilotEdge, for example, is a great service if they work a lot with flight schools and whatnot to provide the real-life equivalent of ATC. Because obviously, as a student in a simulator, you can't just call up real air traffic control. So PilotEdge is one of those services that they use. Let me show this here. So this is PilotEdge. For $20, you get ZLA, which is Los Angeles Center, right? So they control everything, including Los Angeles, San Diego, even into Vegas. Those are the big airports they cover. Or you can pay $20 and you get the Western expansion, which is the western half of the US without Los Angeles Center included. Or, excuse me, you pay $35 a month, you get all of this area, right? Again, what that means, guaranteed service. When you connect with your flight simulator, you get service there. Yes?
What's the difference in the colors of dots?
The difference in the colors of dots. I want to say those are different airports, but I can't be 100% sure. But I think it's just different airports that they cover. But again, any airport that lies within this area, if there's an airport, there's lots of smaller airports also that are not depicted on this map, they'll cover those as well. All right, so for example, if you're flying into Reed Hillview in San Jose, that is covered. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, VATSIM and IVAO. Coverage is global, right? So they're VATSIM, this is more of a VATSIM specific example because I'm mostly familiar with them. They're divided into these sections, right? So even in the US and North America, they're divided into these 26 real world, what mirrors the real world of air route traffic control centers. So the Houston ARTCC, where I work down here, controls, west side of Texas all the way into Louisiana, including New Orleans. So when I work Houston Center, I may be controlling all the airports that are in this space right here if there's nobody else on helping me control. Let's talk about getting started. Figure out what it is you're trying to get out of this, right? How much money do you want to spend on this? Do you want to spend $20, $35 a month on something like a PilotEdge, but you want the guaranteed service? Or do you want something that's free and you don't care about staffing, right? You may have to go, well, okay, there's no VATSIM controller on in Houston, but there may be somebody on in Los Angeles. So does that change your flight plan? Are you okay with that, right? Are you okay flying LA to Vegas instead of Houston to Dallas, right? That kind of is where you got to figure out what you want out of it. Number two, something really critical is know the airplane you're flying. The online network is not there to teach you how to fly an airplane. And the online network is something you want to add after you know how to fly your airplane, right? Because we, as controllers, we can't teach you how to fly an A320. That's just not in the scope of what we do. But what you want to do is make sure you know how to fly that particular airplane. You know the procedures. There's lots of manuals. There's lots of YouTube videos on how to fly the actual plane. So that's kind of key. With PilotEdge, you create an account, you download the client from their pilot center. It's pretty simple. That's it. That's all there's to it. With VATSIM, it gets a little more complicated because you create an account and then you choose a region and division and then you download the client. And here's the different regions in VATSIM. And all that really means is you kind of choose your, I want to say, spiritual home, in quotes, right? Where do you do your most flying? For example, I fly mostly in North America. That's sort of my home. Think of it as your home airport or your home region. But it does not mean you can't fly anywhere else, right? I can just pop up in Germany or the UK or whatever. But this is sort of your spiritual home where you want to be based. And then, are you flying solo? Are you flying just by yourself, just for fun? Are you flying with a virtual airline like Virtual United or Virtual American? There's lots of virtual airlines out there that help, for me at least, bring a lot more. I don't want to just fly just for the sake of flying. I want to accumulate points, or I want to fly the routes or the timetables that they have, right? Again, it adds to that realism. And then there's tools. I have a slide at the very end that talks about links to the different tools. You can use SkyVector or FlightAware that are tools that you can use to plan your flight, right? So for your route of flight and your loadout of your plane, that kind of stuff. And then VATSIM, IVAO, PilotEdge, and even the virtual airlines to a degree, they all have training systems where you can learn how to fly and how to communicate. They all have a lot of really good stuff. For example, VATSIM has not only controller certifications where we rank up to control different levels, you also have pilot certifications where you have to perform, or you have to meet certain criteria, you do certain exams, and then you rank up as a pilot, and it's all there for you to learn. At FlightSim Expo, VATSIM and IVAO have booths here, so they're out there. If you got a chance to talk to them, that's cool. Their networks are staffed by volunteers, which is why it's free. There's some paid, quote unquote, positions, but I think within management, I don't know the exact answer to that, but there is no, for me as a controller, I do it because I want to, right? It's an entirely volunteer job, I don't get paid for it. PilotEdge is staffed by actual employees of PilotEdge, right? They get compensated because they provide an actual like 9 to 5 type service. And then just poke around, see which one's right for you. Something that I mentioned earlier is communication, right? Communication, getting started with that, because that's, in the end, that's what you're doing, primarily with flying online. You're talking to ATC a lot. How do you get started? What is that, how do you get over that fear of talking to somebody, like clicking the push to talk button and saying, okay, I'm somebody, right? But what do I tell them, right? Who am I, what am I doing? Communication is key, right? It's very important that you say the right things.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
So this is one of my absolutely all-time favorite commercials ever. It brings to a point exactly what I'm talking about here, right? It's like you want to make sure you're understood, you speak the language, you know how to articulate yourself, right? Because what we see here is, failure to communicate. I highlighted this in red. It's bold, underlined, and italicized because the key here is we all started somewhere. Like I said, when I first started flying for real, I was really scared to push the talk button because I didn't know what to say, okay? So what do? What's your first step? You get yourself a German flight instructor, and they will teach you communication. My flight instructor happened to be German, so we did all my flying in German, and he taught me radio communication pat. He told me what to say, when to say it. He was really good. There is a network called Live ATC. Anybody show hands? Live ATC? Oh, okay, all right, say no more. I happen to be one of the volunteer feed providers, so if you ever listen to Georgetown, Texas, that is the feed that I set up. It sits in a little airport closet and picks up communication there. And that's obviously one way to learn, right? Listen to what people actually say. Listen to approach control, listen to ground, listen to clearance. Learn sort of what people are saying. PilotEdge on their homepage in their Pilot Center has a great video. It's a step-by-step description of their first flight, and then it walks you through the flight, and then there's a YouTube video of the guy actually doing the flight, right? So if you want to know how to do the first step, watch that video. That's kind of cool. And then, of course, YouTube is your friend. I Googled last night, learn air traffic communication. There's so many videos, and they're really good, too, right? They're quality videos by guys who want to teach you how to do this. Now, they're not professional instructors necessarily, but there's a lot of basic knowledge that you can pick up. Use the INSIM ATC function, right? So Microsoft Flight Simulator, like I said, has basic ATC. The new version is actually pretty decent, right? If you do an instrument flight from Los Angeles to San Francisco, you can get essentially full ATC coverage with the basic communications. So that's pretty cool. I appreciate that. One of the things that's key is learn the alphabet. A alpha, B Bravo, C Charlie, that kind of stuff, right? So those are things that you need to know because, the controls may say, turn left on taxiway Charlie. I don't know, it doesn't say Charlie, it says C, right? So Charlie is C, so that's something important to know. And then you got to start with the 5 W's. Who are you talking to? Who are you? Where are you? What is your request? And what information do you have, right? So for example, here, I'm calling up Austin clearance. I'm sitting in Austin on the ground. I want to go fly. And I say Austin clearance, Cessna 5327 Golf at Millionaire, VFR to the north, and we have Juliet. All right? That's a lot of information in a short time span, but the controllers know exactly what you're saying when you say this. They know who you are, where you are, and what you want. Part of the etiquette of flying online is make sure that when you load up your simulator, which by default for most simulators will put you on the runway ready to fly, put it somewhere at a gate or a ramp or a parking location, right? Because the last thing you want to do is pop up in somebody's simulation who's given guidance by ATC and they're being given a guidance to taxi and take off. You don't want to just pop onto the runway because now you're taken away from that realism that everybody else is. Because you can't just do that in real life either, right? In Prepared, for example, down here at the bottom, that's where you sit. By default, it will say active runway. Pick a parking location. Pick a gate. You know, if you're flying an A320, pick gate, 14, I don't know, whatever. So whatever the airport is you're at. And in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it's kind of up here. It's not super obvious, but it'll put you by default on a runway, and you just tell it, hey, instead put me at a gate. And then, depending on the network you're using, for example, with VATSIM, a client is called vPilot, Virtual Pilot. It's a piece of software that runs separate from your simulator, and that's what you'll use to connect to the network, right? And what you do is you put in your aircraft type and your call sign. So what that looks like is, right here, it's a little small, but there's a Boeing B738, so it's a Boeing 737-800, and then here's the call sign, right? And then you put that in for every flight. So when you connect to the network, it shows the controller some basic information, right? That's all they get to see is your Boeing 737-800 and your call sign. And then, I'll actually go back here one step. There's an option in vPilot to file a flight plan. Under the options, you put in where you want to fly to. Even if you want to stay in the pattern in the airport or fly VFR, just say, hey, VFR to the north, right? At least that when you pop into the controller's screen, they kind of know what to expect. Don't be afraid to put newbie in the notes. That's pretty, as controllers, we see that all the time. Don't try to just muddle through it. Just let us know, right? We're there to help. Now, depending on the controller you work with, they may be more or less inclined to help you as a newbie. For me, what I always do, especially because I like giving these presentations, I love helping out people who are new, who have not done this stuff before, right? So I have a lot of patience. Some other controllers may not have a lot of patience. It's kind of, your mileage will vary. But putting newbie in there lets us know that, hey, this guy may need an extra minute or extra hand or just may need some tips on what to do. And when in doubt, ask, right? We are always there to help, typically. So we're going to talk about the different positions. And just like at a real world airport, with PilotEdge, all the positions are staffed, right? And depending on the real world equivalent, they will staff those positions. So a position, for example, at Georgetown, they have a ground and a tower. So in PilotEdge, that is simulated. You can call up ground, Georgetown ground, you can call up Georgetown tower. Now, I know this is a bad example because Georgetown is in Texas and it's outside their coverage area, but bear with me. So you may speak to the same person multiple times, right? And they may act as ground, they may act as tower, but you'll be changing frequency. They'll tell you to change frequencies, all those things, right? So it's all simulated. San Diego, for example, they have a clearance delivery, they have a ground tower and approach departure. That's all correctly simulated in PilotEdge. And there's a common traffic advisory frequency. Here's a chart. If you pull up a VFR chart on SkyVector, for example, and you look, if you want to know what the CTAF frequency is for a particular airport, look for the C in a magenta circle, right? 122.8, that is the CTAF, Common Traffic Advisory Frequency. So if you're flying in the pattern in Taylor, for example, at an uncontrolled airport, that is the frequency you're talking to talk to other airplanes that are in the area, that are not talking to ATC. And that goes back to kind of building up that picture, that mental image in your head of what's happening at the airport. With VATSIM, CTAF 122.8 globally, right? So that's the entire airspace, no matter where you are, 122.8 is your CTAF frequency. And then anybody who is online and controlling, because that varies, there's no schedule for when we control, right? When I control, I say, hey, I'm working from home today. I can spend an hour or two, and I will control. But I will control Austin approach, or I will control Houston center. Kind of depends on A, what I feel like, and B, what other positions are currently staffed. Can I help out somewhere? But in your vPilot client, you get a list of the controllers that are currently active. So in this case, it's only Los Angeles Center controller that's on, so you'd be working with the Los Angeles Center controller the entire time because nobody else is there to talk to. Any questions so far? Anything? Yes?
Regarding the CTAF, does that mean that you're going to hear all around the world everyone's communications, or only the CTAF communications that are in range?
Great question. So CTAF, the question is, will you hear everybody else's communication or just whoever is within range? That has changed over the past years. Most of the networks, or essentially all the networks at this point, have gone to sort of, again, monitor what the real world equivalent is. So you will definitely not hear somebody who is on the East Coast talk on your CTAF frequency. No, absolutely. They try to be much better at simulating even things like line of sight. If there's a mountain in the way, you will not hear them, right? But if you have, it's not uncommon for airports to have the same CTAF frequency. So if there's 3 airports within a close proximity that have the same frequency, you will probably hear other planes as well, absolutely. Yes?
You obviously enjoy what you do. That's great. But why don't you go to work for PilotEdge and get paid for it?
Okay, so the question is, I obviously enjoy what I do, but why don't I go work for PilotEdge and get paid for it? Well, trust me, I've thought about it, okay? However, yeah, that's a good question. I love working in IT, so that's my career. That's what I do, right? And I don't necessarily want to do this flying stuff because I can and when I want to. That's why also I'm not a commercial pilot for an airline because I fly when I want to and it's fun for me. It's not something I necessarily want to do for a living. That's a great question, though. All right, so with VATSIM, because not all the positions are simulated, or are not necessarily staffed at all times, sorry, there is sort of a hierarchy to things. And it kind of goes in hand with how we're trained. Because as a volunteer controller, they don't just let you loose on the network. They don't just say, here, go control Houston Center, right? Because you can't, because you don't, just like a pilot, you need to learn what to do. So in VATSIM, for example, we have observers, and then we have a student 1, student 2, student 3. And what that means is we learn how to control clearance delivery, then ground, then tower, then approach departure, and then center. So you kind of work yourself up through the different ranks, and then only center controllers can control center and below. Tower controllers cannot control approach and departure. All right. But also kind of goes back to, hey, if a center controller is on, they will provide you services potentially all the way down to ground and clearance. If nobody else is on, you can get clearance delivery service from the center controller. So that's just one of the things to keep in mind is when you're on a network like VATSIM, just because there's no clearance or ground controller on, you can still get that service. Here's an app called VATSpy. VATSpy gives you an overview of what's happening on the VATSIM network. And that's updated, I want to say, every 30 or 60 seconds is the update frequency. So what's depicted here is these blue lines. Those are air route traffic control centers. In Europe, they're called radars. And they, so somebody's controlling this. I don't know which radar sector this is, but if anybody knows, please shout it out. But here you have the green circle is an approach controller who's online, and then you have G for ground and T for tower. And Bremen? Okay, thank you. Bremen radar. That's what I thought it was, but I didn't want to misspeak. Thank you. And then you see you got 4 airplanes that are ready for takeoff and 1 airplane that's coming in to Hamburg. So A is for ATIS. That's somebody either is recording an ATIS for weather information, or they use the automated broadcast system. It's a client that we use called VATIS, which, just like the real world equivalent, it reads the data from the actual weather, and then puts out weather information such as temperature and barometric pressure. So there's a radar controller over here, and over here there's only a tower controller, right? So when you fly out of Lübeck, no, that's not Lübeck, EDL, okay. If you fly out of this airport here, again, you have a tower controller and you have weather information. So knowing this, you got the tower controller will provide you anything from clearance delivery to ground taxi instructions to takeoff instructions, right? But because there's nobody on working above the tower controller, he can't give you departure clearances or departure services. He cannot give you center services or radar services. So in this particular example, what would happen is, you line up your plane, get ready, take off, and then let's say, for example, you're flying over towards Hamburg, then as you enter this blue area, and that's kind of, you got to keep an eye on it on something like a VAT spike, because it's not necessarily obvious. You will then call up the radar controller and say, hey, my call sign is X, Y, and Z, and they'll give you a squawk code, and then that way they'll provide you further services as you're flying into Hamburg, and then they'll hand you to the approach controller, and then they'll hand you to tower, ground, et cetera. Okay, just something to be aware of, because that's one of the things I struggled with initially with VATSIM is like, who do I talk to? And again, if you have questions, ask the controllers. Yes?
So if there's only tower, and you're going somewhere and there's no controller in between, is there an area, do you keep on communicating your intentions, or how does that work when there's nobody on the other side?
Okay, yeah, so for example, the question was, if there's nobody on in between, let's say the towered airport, and if you're flying out in this area, is there like communication? No, there really isn't, because you don't have anybody to talk to, right? What you would do is you would tune, the tower controller will tell you somewhere like frequency change approved, or change to CTAF, change to 122.8, right? So they will typically tell you that, because while you're flying in this uncontrolled airspace, there's really nobody to talk to. And you're kind of, again, it's one of those things you're kind of on your own in that particular space. But again, this goes back to do you want continuous service the entire way, or are you okay with that, right? Is that you're not paying for it, but yet at the same time, you may have limited services. So here's Los Angeles Center, which we fall under here. And what you can see is there's only a Los Angeles Center controller on and the ATIS at one of the airports at LAX. The nice thing is, if you're flying in this area, you can get services in that entire area, right? Because this guy knows all the airports pretty well, Los Angeles, Vegas, San Diego. So this one controller will potentially work dozens of airports. We don't usually get that kind of traffic level. If we're expecting that traffic level, we'll have more staff typically if it's some kind of event. But yeah, this guy could be working lots of aircraft and lots of airports at the same time. So let's talk about how do you start at an uncontrolled airport. An uncontrolled airport is something that doesn't have a tower, doesn't have air traffic control. Anybody know a uncontrolled airport in nearby? I'm sorry? French Valley? Okay, all right, cool. All right, so that would be a good example. Was there a question? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, what is the recommended procedure when you go to an uncontrolled airport from a controlled one?
The question is, if I heard you right, what is the procedure of flying from an uncontrolled to a controlled, or vice versa? Okay, yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. Essentially, if you're flying, the summary here is if you're flying from an uncontrolled airport to a controlled airport, once you enter the controlled area, you start talking to ATC, right? Kind of like that previous slide where you take off from, let's say the tower wasn't on, you just take off and you fly towards Hamburg. As you approach that blue boundary, you dial in that frequency. In your pilot client, you can see the frequency of the controller, and then you can start talking to them. All right, uncontrolled airport. You connect your to the network, and you pick up a local weather if you can, if it's being broadcast. Again, that may be weather, for example, in Georgetown. Here's an ATIS frequency, 118.6. May or may not be broadcasting. So again, but for realism, if it's being broadcast, yeah, might as well pick up the weather. There's phone numbers, for example. I have a phone number for Austin ATIS. If I'm not anywhere near internet, I can call a phone number and I can listen to the ATIS. Yeah.
Just about anywhere, if you type in Google, METAR stands for meteorological report, and then space, and then the four-letter ICAO code, like KSAN for San Diego, it'll take you straight to the weather report. And it'll list a few different places you can click on. One is just the METAR, which you have to learn how to decode. Another one lists it all out in plain English. But you can get the weather just by Googling that airfield and the word METAR, M-E-T-A-R.
Yeah, great, thank you. So if you Google METAR, M-E-T-A-R, and the airport, the four-letter airport code or four-letter digits, you'll get a result for the weather. There's various apps for iPhones and Android that, I don't have it with me, but there's apps, and I can talk about that later if anybody's interested, that allow you just put in your airport code and it'll give you a real-world METAR or something in that area. Was there?
Yeah, if you tune into ANUS or ASOS, AWOS, are you getting that from the VATSIM network, or are you getting that from InSim?
So the question is, if you're tuning into the METAR, are you getting that service from VATSIM or are you getting it from InSim? It depends, right? So you can actually potentially get both. If you're at an airport where there is an ATIS, for example, Microsoft Flight Simulator will start scrolling the weather, across the screen, which you've seen. And I typically turn that off because what happens when I connect to VATSIM, I want to listen to the actual ATIS coming from the VATSIM network, whatever they're broadcasting, right? So you can either get none, you can get the one from the simulator, or potentially both. So just
Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking.
yeah.
You probably want to turn ATC off.
Yeah, exactly. You want to typically, if you're flying online, turn off the weather in the simulator because otherwise it may overlap. Again, it's one of those things where Microsoft Flight Simulator, now they pull in real-world weather data, right? Whereas before, it was just some kind of made-up weather typically. Tune to the CTAF at your uncontrolled airport, 122.8, and start talking. Who are you, where are you, and what are your intentions? So for an example of that would be Taylor traffic, Skyline 855 Sierra Papa, taxiing from the hangars to runway 17 Taylor. So you're saying, who are you, where are you, and what are you doing, right? Pretty simple. And the reason you kind of want to get in the habit of saying the identifier again at the end, what if somebody tunes into your communication right here? They miss the initial call, what airport it's for. So we always are taught as pilots, say what you have to say, and then repeat the airport identifier. That way, if you're in a place where there's multiple airports sharing the same CTAF, that happens more frequently than you think. If somebody steps on your communication or somebody tunes in late, then they have another chance to hear, who you're talking to. And then once you've taxied to the runway, Skyline 855 Sierra Papa, departing runway 17, straight out departure Taylor, right? So again, you say who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. And then when you get in range, let's say I'm flying up to Austin approach is on. When I get within 20 miles of Austin approach, I dial in their frequency and I call them up, all right? And I say something like 855 Sierra Papa, 20 miles to the north, inbound full stop. Okay, yeah, go back one more. So for example, let's say, oops, wrong button. Let's say you're flying from an uncontrolled airport out here and you fly into Los Angeles Center's coverage area. As you approach this boundary here, it doesn't mean you have to talk to them right here or exactly here. It's kind of as you're approaching this, right? Because they will be able to see you probably slightly outside of that range. But they won't see you, let's say you're out here, don't call them up when you're 400 miles out and expect services. They probably won't be able to see you on their radar client. And here's what I was talking about earlier, Austin approach, Skyline 855 Sierra Papa, 20 miles to the north, full stop with ATIS. It means that to the controller says I've already picked up the weather, I know what the temperature is, I know what the altimeter is. All right, here's a controlled airport. That gets a little more tricky, slightly more intimidating for me initially, but once you learn how to do it, it's actually a lot of fun. Now, I love talking on the radio. It's absolutely one of my most fun things to do when flying. When you're connected to the network, file a flight plan. Right? So you're going to say, I'm flying from Austin to Vegas. And then, obviously, you've already kind of figured out what you're going to do. You may want to fly direct. You may want to pick a route using one of the route planning tools. But that goes in your flight plan. And when you submit that, it goes to the network, and the controller can see that. Oh, almost in time. OK, all right, good. I got like 5 minutes. Right. Get the weather. Be prepared to copy down your clearance. Clearances can be pretty lengthy. OK, so write down what the clearance you're going to get. You're going to contact ATC, identify who you are, where you are, and what your intentions are. You're going to give a clearance here, Skyline 855 Sierra Papa signature, VFR to these. Pretty simple. Okay. IFR gets a little more tricky. Austin clearance, Southwest 4170, Gate 12, IFR to Vegas. You'll get a clearance something like Southwest 4170, Austin clearance. You're cleared to McCarran International Airport via the Mucky 3 departure. Mucky then is filed, maintain 4000. Expect flight level 3601 minutes after departure. Departure 119.0, squawk 4785. Okay? Who can repeat that? Okay, yeah, good, great. The pilots or controllers, good. But you can also repeat it if you've written it down. Take notes, right? So that's key. Copy down your clearance and read it back, and then you go from there. And once you're ready to go, you switch to ground and call up ground or the next higher facility and talk to them and say, hey, Austin ground, Southwest 4170, request push and taxi. Or, and once you get to the runway, you contact tower, or if tower's not on, but departure is on, you can contact departure. If departure is not on, center is on, you can contact center. Typically, though, what they'll do is the ground controller, if let's say ground is on and center is on, ground would tell you to contact center for takeoff and departure and that kind of stuff. And typically what happens is after you take off from an airport, you always want to check in with ATC. So once you're 2,000 feet up, you'll say something like Austin departure, Southwest 4170, 2,000 climbing 4,000. You're checking in with the controller. They may be busy working other airports. You're just reminding them that you're there, and then they'll give you a radar contact. It may also be a center controller. All right, here's some useful links. All the different networks have some training stuff here. There's some virtual airline listings. There's tools for flight planning. And then here's a link for the ATOP program. We didn't get a chance to talk about that. Here's my contact information. The guys will have all the slides available from the presentation. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, email me, hit me up on the whatever gram. And then check out ATOP. It's cool. It's a really good program, open for anybody who has at least a student pilot license. And it's cool because you get to 2 days in either Orlando or Dallas. You get to fly either the 737 at American Airlines or the JetBlue A320. And you can actually log your approaches because it's a full, it's what the airlines use for their pilots. That's me when I did it. And then, you're going to be in good company because there's also people like Lester Holt and other people who have done this. And Wayne, Uncle Wayne, who's the guy who runs the program, super nice guy. He's great to work with, so. All right, cool.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. All right, we are on a break. We'll be back at 1:30 with the practical simulator use as a training ed session.